Arizona Territory, 1882. The morning sun had barely crested the red cliffs when Whit Carmichael rode into the town of Dry Creek with dust on his boots and a rifle slung across his back, just in time to see the whole town stop and stare at the woman stepping off the eastbound stagecoach pregnant, alone and holding the hand of a small boy. Whit pulled his horse to a halt, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. The widow, by the look of her dark dress, moved with quiet purpose. Her belly was heavy with child, and the boy no more than 5 clung to her skirt like he had not known safety in some time. Whit saw it then, the way she held herself, proud but worn. He'd seen that look before in men who had fought too long and come home to nothing. "Who is she?" he asked the stable hand as he dismounted. The boy shrugged. "Name's Willa O'Hara. Came from New Mexico, I think. Folks say her husband died in a mining collapse. Left her with the boy and another on the way." Whit watched as Willa O'Hara walked past the general store. People whispered. Some smiled behind hands that hid no kindness. Dry Creek was small and it had long memories. A young widow, pregnant and alone? That was all the folks needed to start talking. Inside the mercantile, Willa kept her chin up as she counted her coins. The shopkeep, a leathery woman with a harsh tongue, narrowed her eyes. "You planning to stay here?" Willa nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I bought a small house on the edge of town. I'll pay my way." The shopkeep sniffed. "Well, we do not take kindly to women raising bastards here." The words hit the air like a slap. Willa's fingers tightened around her son's hand, but she did not flinch. "Then you should be grateful mine are not bastards." She turned and walked out. Whit, standing outside, caught her eye. She hesitated a second, then nodded once, polite but guarded. Later that week, Whit saw her again, this time trying to hammer boards across a broken window, while her son tried to keep hold of a sack of nails. The wind kicked up dust, and the boy stumbled. Without thinking, Whit stepped off his porch and crossed the street. "You need help," he said. Willa looked down from the ladder. "I did not ask for any." Whit crossed his arms. "And yet here I am." She studied him. Her son peeked around her skirt. "What is your name?" the boy asked. "Whit Carmichael." "I am Henry," the boy said proudly. "Mama says we are starting over." Whit knelt. "That's so? Starting over's hard. You helping her?" Henry nodded. "I carry nails." Whit looked up at Willa. "I can fix that window." She hesitated, then stepped down. "All right, but I will pay you." "Not necessary," Whit said, reaching for the hammer. "I insist." He looked at her, then not just at the curve of her belly or the tired lines around her eyes, but the steel underneath. This was not a woman looking for pity. She had come here with a plan, no matter how broken the pieces. By sunset, the window was patched, and Henry was asleep on the floor inside, curled up with a blanket and a wooden horse. "You did not have to help," Willa said from the doorway. Whit leaned against the porch railing. "I know." She watched him for a moment, then stepped closer. "People are laughing. I hear them. They think I am some fool who got herself knocked up and now wants charity." "They are wrong," Whit said simply. Willa's jaw clenched. "My husband was not a good man. He drank. Hit me once. I left and ran back to my father's ranch. But when I got there, he had already passed from fever. I had no one left. Then the boy's father came to get me. Said he changed. He had not. He died in a cave in 2 months ago after leaving us in a shack with no food." Whit stared at her, silent. "I could not stay there," she whispered. "So I came here. I bought a house with what little I had left. I will give birth alone if I have to. I just want peace." He looked at her closely. "You are not alone anymore." She blinked, unsure how to respond. The next few weeks passed in quiet rhythm. Whit helped fix the roof, brought wood for the stove, and taught Henry how to ride a pony. Willa worked harder than anyone he had ever seen, sewing for the general store and baking bread she sold to the boarding house. She never asked for help, but she never refused it when Whit offered. People whispered more, laughed when he walked beside her at the market, laughed when he sat near her on Sundays in the back pew, and they laughed loudest the day he stood on the church steps and asked her to marry him. It was not fancy, no ring, just his hand held out and his voice steady. "Why?" she asked, tears already in her eyes. "Because I want to, because Henry deserves a father, because you deserve someone who will not leave." She stared at him for a long time. Then she whispered, "Yes." They married a week later under the cottonwoods behind the chapel. The preacher stammered through the vows, trying to hide his surprise. Whit held Willa's hand tight, and Henry stood between them, grinning. The town laughed. Loud. "Mean," said the cowboy was a fool for marrying a woman with someone else's baby in her belly. But what they did not know, what no one in Dry Creek knew, was the truth Willa had carried all the way from New Mexico. The baby she carried was not her husband's. He had not touched her for nearly a year before he died. The father was a soldier, a kind man who had helped her once, then vanished. She had never spoken his name, but Whit never asked, and that was why she loved him, not because he rescued her, but because he saw her, knew her, wanted her anyway. And as the sun dipped low behind the red cliffs, Whit kissed her slow and sure, his hand resting gently on her belly. Henry tugged at his coat, grinning. "Can I call you Papa now?" Whit smiled. "I would like that very much." And Willa's heart, battered and bruised, finally felt whole. It was late May when the peach tree behind the house bloomed, pale blossoms softening the harsh line of the desert. Willa stood barefoot in the dirt, one hand on her lower back, the other shading her eyes as she watched Henry chase a grasshopper near the fence. Her belly was full and low now. The baby would come soon. She knew the signs, remembered them too clearly from Henry's birth, the way her hips ached differently, how her breath caught when she bent too long, the strange, distant pull inside her that told her to prepare. Whit had taken to rising early, hitching the wagon at first light and riding out toward the foothills where he'd signed on to help with branding season. It was hard work and hotter than it had any right to be, but he never came back without something in his hands: salt pork from the cook fire, a bundle of sage, a strip of soft leather for Henry's boots. That evening, he returned with a wooden cradle strapped behind the saddle. Willa stepped onto the porch as he unfastened it. "Where did that come from?" "Old man Tolbert's barn. Said it had been sitting empty since his youngest married off. I patched the bottom and sanded the edges." He set it down carefully at her feet. "Thought maybe the little one ought to have somewhere better than a drawer." She ran her fingers over the rim. The wood was rough but solid. "You didn't need to." "I know." She didn't say thank you. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because with Whit, gratitude had begun to feel like breath, constant, quiet, understood. That night, after Henry fell asleep with his head on Whit's knee, Willa sat at the table and stitched a bundle of muslin cloths. A warm wind moved through the open window. She reached for a pair of booties she'd knitted from leftover wool and held them in her palm, wondering what her daughter's hair would feel like. She didn't speak the thought aloud. Whit's voice came low. "I want to be there when it happens." She looked up. "Childbirth isn't a thing men usually see." "I'm not most men." Willa folded the cloth. "You'll need to fetch Miss Evie from the mission house when it starts. She's done this before." "I'll be there too." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. Not fear, not pity, just steadiness. She nodded. "All right." The next morning, Henry woke with a cough deep enough to rattle. Willa gave him horehound syrup and laid a cool cloth across his brow while Whit rode to Dr. Fisher's cabin. The doctor came late, smelling of pipe smoke and sweat. his hands stained from delivering a foal the night before. Whit waited outside with his jaw clenched tight. When the door creaked open, Willa stepped out. "He'll be fine. Just a summer cold." Whit exhaled slow. "You sure?" She nodded. "Doctor said to keep him cool and resting." "He's not worried." Whit touched her shoulder lightly, his fingers brushing the edge of her collarbone. "I am." She leaned into the touch, just for a moment. "I know." 3 days later, when the sun hung low and the birds went quiet, Willa's water broke. She gripped the edge of the washbasin and called Whit's name, her voice sharper than she meant. Henry sat up on the mattress, his eyes wide. Whit moved faster than she'd ever seen him, lifting Henry into his arms and setting him near the hearth. "You stay here, all right? I'll be right back." He galloped toward the mission house, dust rising behind him. Evie arrived not long after, her sleeves rolled and her hair pinned tight, carrying a satchel of linen and herbs. Willa let them help her to the bed, sweat already beading along her forehead. "It's early," she muttered between clenched teeth. "Not by much," Evie replied. "And you're strong." The hours passed in hard silence. Whit sat just outside the door, Henry asleep beside him. The fire burned low. Coyotes called in the distance. When Willa cried out sharp and ragged, Whit stood. "I'm going in." Evie met him at the threshold, her apron streaked. "She's almost there. If you come in, you don't leave." "I'm staying." Inside, Willa gripped the headboard, her face pale with effort. When she saw him, her eyes filled. "I can't." "Yes, you can," he said, kneeling beside her. "You already are." She bore down with a scream that tore through the house, and then the room went quiet except for the sound of a newborn's first, gasping wail. Evie caught the child in a clean cloth, her voice trembling. "It's a girl." Willa sobbed once, her whole body shaking. Whit wrapped his arms around her shoulders, holding her upright. Evie handed the child over, and Willa cradled the girl against her chest. The baby blinked, mouth rooting. Whit touched the back of the baby's head, reverent. "She's perfect." Willa closed her eyes. "I want to name her Clara." He nodded. "Clara Carmichael." Willa looked at him then, exhaustion softening the lines of her face. "You mean that?" "I married you," he said, "and everything that comes with you." She turned toward the cradle he'd built and smiled faintly. "Then lay her there, just a moment. I want to see her sleep." He took the baby gently and placed her in the cradle. Her tiny fists curled near her face. Willa reached for his hand. "I didn't think I'd ever be safe again." "You are now." Outside, the wind shifted. The peach blossoms began to fall. June brought heat that settled deep in the bones and stayed there. The ground cracked in wide, dry veins around the Carmichael homestead, and the breeze carried grit instead of relief. Whit rose before light and worked until his shirt clung to him, splitting fence rails and hauling water from the spring 2 ridges over. Willa kept to the shaded side of the house, rocking Clara in the sling she'd sewn from an old cotton shift, while Henry followed Whit like a barn cat, asking about every nail and knot. Inside the house, the quiet changed. The stillness that had once felt cautious now breathed comfort. Willa no longer flinched at every knock or sudden silence. She moved with ease, shoulders looser, her voice no longer guarded when she called for Whit, or when she sang to Clara in low, humming tones that drifted out the windows and caught on the wind. One morning, Whit paused mid-chop when he heard Henry's voice carry from the porch. "Mama says we might get chickens." Whit set the axe down and wiped his brow with his sleeve. "You like eggs that much?" Henry swung his legs. "I like that they'd be ours. Everything else we had belonged to someone else before." Whit looked up at the house. Willa stood just inside the doorway, her hand resting on the frame, listening. "Then we'll build a coop," Whit said. That evening, after Clara had gone down and Henry curled under a quilt Willa had stitched with careful, even hands, Whit sat outside sharpening his knife beneath the porch lamp. Willa stepped out barefoot, her hair loose for the first time in days. "I've been thinking," she said, settling beside him on the top step. "Dangerous habit." She gave a soft huff. "I want to plant something, not just the kitchen herbs. Something that needs time." Whit glanced at her. "Like what?" "Corn. Maybe a few rows of beans. Something with roots." He nodded once, slowly. "I'll clear the patch near the sycamore. The soil's softer there." She folded her hands in her lap. "I used to dream of land. Not much. Just a stretch I could touch and say, 'This is mine.' But I never stayed anywhere long enough. You're staying now." "I am." They sat in the hush that followed, the kind that didn't ask for words. The moon climbed higher, casting pale light across the yard. A coyote called from far off, and Whit's arm brushed hers as he shifted. "You think I'm a fool?" she asked quietly. He turned toward her. "For what?" "For loving you this fast." "It wasn't fast," he said. "It just waited a long time to begin." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't think I could love again. Not in a real way. Not with the pieces I had left." "You didn't have pieces," Whit said. "You had fire. You just needed wood." Willa leaned gently against him then, her head resting against his shoulder. He didn't move, just sat there, steady as stone. The next morning, Whit rode out to the mercantile and came back with seed sacks tied behind the saddle. He didn't say much, only handed her the bags and nodded toward the spot he'd cleared. She pressed her palm to the earth and smiled. Later that week, a letter arrived from Las Cruces, carried by a passing trader. It was addressed to Willa, the script unfamiliar. She read it on the porch, her expression unreadable. When Whit stepped outside with Clara in his arms, he paused. "Bad news." She folded the paper and tucked it into her apron. "No, just something I didn't expect." He waited. "My sister's boy," she said. "He's been in a boarding school since she passed. I didn't know. He's 13 now. They're asking if I'll take him." Whit looked down at Clara, then back to Willa. "Do you want to?" "I think I should." Her voice was quiet. "He's family, and I know what it feels like to be left." Whit nodded slowly. "Then we'll make room." She exhaled, her shoulders slumping with something like relief. "It won't be easy. Nothing worth building ever is." She stepped forward and took Clara into her arms. "He'll need guidance. He's half mescalero. Never even met his father." Whit studied her. "Then he'll need folks who'll let him be whole." Willa blinked hard but didn't look away. 2 weeks later, the boy arrived by freight coach, thin and silent, with a bag slung over one shoulder and scars on his hands from God knew what. Willa met him at the stop, kneeling so he wouldn't feel looked down on. "You can call me Aunt Willa," she said. He didn't answer, but he didn't pull away when she placed a hand on his arm. That night, Whit gave him Henry's spare cot and didn't ask questions. The boy said little, but his eyes followed everything Whit did: the way he tied rope, the way he spoke gently to the horses, the way he touched Willa's back when he passed her. Willa watched it all with quiet awareness. She didn't try to force closeness, just made space. Weeks passed. The boy, whose name was Elias, began to help with the planting. He didn't speak much, but one afternoon, he handed Willa a carved piece of mesquite which shaped like a bird. She ran her thumb along the wing, then looked up to find him already gone. Whit found him that evening sitting by the coop. "You don't have to prove anything," Whit said, squatting beside him. "You're already part of this, even if you don't feel it yet." Elias didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. That night, when Willa lay beside Whit in the dark, she whispered, "You knew what this would take." "I knew it'd be worth it," he said. And somewhere between the creak of the floorboards and Clara's slow breathing, Willa reached for his hand beneath the quilt. They stayed that way until morning. By mid-July, the beans had taken root and the corn was pushing above Willa's knees. The land, stubborn though it was, had softened under her hands. The rows were neat, watered daily with buckets drawn from the spring, and Elias worked without being asked, his silence not cold but watchful. He spent long hours near the edges of things: the fence line, the coop, the doorway never fully inside but no longer apart. One morning, Willa found him oiling the hinges on the barn door. "Did the creaking bother you?" she asked, tying her hair back with a strip of linen. Elias didn't look up. Sounded like something crying. She crouched beside him. "You're good at noticing. Hard not to. When you grow up waiting for bad things, you learn to listen different." She didn't rush to respond. Instead, she reached into the basket she carried and handed him a folded square of blue cloth. "It was my sister's," she said. "I thought you might want it." He unfolded it slowly. The edges were frayed, but the patterned white stars on deep blue was still clear. He ran his thumb over one corner, then tucked it into his pocket without a word. Later that week, a storm rolled down from the mountains, the kind that broke the air wide open. Wind lashed the house, and lightning cracked so close it lit the washroom like lantern fire. Henry clung to Whit's arm, Clara cried until her throat gave out, and Willa stood at the window, counting the space between flash and thunder. "It's passing," Whit said, voice steady over the roar. Willa didn't move. "There's a seep near the back fence. If the rain keeps on, it'll flood." He didn't question her, just pulled on his boots and grabbed the shovel off the wall. "I'll go with you," Elias said, already reaching for his coat. Willa turned then. "You don't have to. I know." They worked through the worst of it, digging a shallow trench to guide the water toward the dry arroyo beyond the paddock. Mud slid under their boots, and the rain stung their skin, but neither stopped until the seep had drained and the fence held. Afterward, dripping and breathless, Elias looked across the yard to the house. Light spilled from the kitchen window, yellow and steady. "She waited for me once," he said. "When I was little, my mother, in the hills. There was a fire and she thought I'd been caught in it. She didn't run. She just stood there, calling my name." Willa laid a hand on his back. "You remember it clear. I remember that she didn't leave." Inside, Whit had settled Clara back to sleep. Her cries had faded into quiet hiccups, and Henry now snored softly under the quilt, one hand curled beneath his chin. Willa stripped off her wet dress and dried her hair near the stove, her limbs aching from the work, from the weight of things not spoken aloud. Whit handed her a mug of boiled water steeped with dry mint leaves. "You all right?" she sipped. "I think he's starting to believe this is his home." "He already knows it," Whit said. She set the mug down. "You want to know her name?" "Whose?" "The soldier," she said. "Clara's father." Whit didn't speak. "His name was Thomas. He worked supply trains out of Fort Stanton. Met him the winter before Henry turned 5. He gave me bread and a blanket when Henry was sick and I couldn't find work. We only shared one night. He left before morning." Whit's jaw shifted, but he didn't look away. "I didn't love him," she added, "but he was kind. And that mattered more than anything then." Whit reached across the table and took her hand. "You don't owe me his name. I know. But I wanted you to have it." She leaned forward, her forehead brushing his. The closeness came quiet, warm. He kissed her slowly, without question or claim. Later, when the candles burned low and the storm had passed, Willa lay beside him, her hand resting over his chest. "I thought the hardest part would be surviving," she said. "And now I think the hardest part is believing I'm allowed to stay happy." He turned toward her. "You are. We all are." Outside, the wind had calmed. The rain had left the earth dark and shining, and from the porch, the smell of wet mesquite drifted in like a promise. In the morning, Elias would find a bird's nest blown from the sycamore. He'd bring it to Willa, cradling it carefully, and she would show him how to patch the broken edge with a strip of willow bark. They'd place it back in the low branches where the mother could still find it. And when the days stretched long again, and the corn grew tall enough to shade Henry's shoulders, the boy would ask if the house was big enough for all of them, or if they'd need to build more rooms. Willa would laugh, head tilted back, and say, "We'll build whatever we need." And Whit, watching her from the field, would smile, not the smile of a man who pitied a woman once left behind, but of one who knew the worth of what they'd made. Because the town had laughed once, but they'd stopped now. Now they watched, quiet, curious. And slowly, without anyone saying it aloud, Dry Creek began to change. August came with a dry heat that turned the dirt brittle and pale, the days long and slow under the weight of it. The corn tasseled out, and Clara began to sit up with help, her small hands grasping at the world with quiet determination. Whit had added a rail to the porch so she could be set nearby on warm afternoons, shaded, and watched while Willa shelled beans or mended clothes with her needle and strong thread. Henry had begun reading lessons with Miss Ada from the chapel schoolhouse, carrying his primer in a flour sack and returning each day with questions about everything from the stars to the shape of a river rock. Willa met him at the gate, sometimes with a slice of cooled apple bread, sometimes with just her hand held out, palm up, a silent welcome. Elias had taken to carving in the evenings, his fingers steady with the blade Whit had given him. He never asked what to make, only listened and watched, then turned out horses, birds, and once, a small figure of Clara held in a cradle of cottonwood bark. He sanded it smooth and placed it on the mantel without a word. Willa saw it and said nothing, but the next day a second blanket had been laid on his cot. One morning, Whit returned from the foothills with word that the Patterson place had gone up for sale. The widow had passed, and the land was being parceled. He set his hat on the table and looked to Willa. "They're selling it for near nothing. There's a spring that runs stronger than ours up past their back field. I thought maybe we could use it. For the family, not just the land." Willa looked up from the ledger she'd been keeping in the flour tin. "We'd have to move?" "No," he said. "Just expand. The house stays, but we could use more grazing. Elias has been talking about raising a few goats." She rubbed her thumb along the edge of the page. "We're not rich. I've got 10 head of cattle that'll fetch well come fall. And if we tend the Patterson land right, we could put in enough barley to trade with the station." Willa didn't answer right away. Then she closed the ledger and stood. "Take me there. I want to see it myself." They rode out that afternoon, Clara bundled against Willa's chest and Henry perched behind Whit. Elias rode his borrowed bay with a straight back and a quiet focus that had become his way. The Patterson land rolled out in soft ridges, the grass higher than a man's knee and the spring bubbling clear across black stone. Willa stepped down from the wagon and walked to the edge of it. She knelt, dipped her hand in, then turned back to Whit with something calm and certain in her face. "It'll do," she said. They signed papers with the circuit judge 2 weeks later. Whit traded 2 calves and a month's labor to the buyer's agent, and Willa gave up the silver brooch she'd kept from her mother. Not because she had to, but because she wanted the land to be a piece of all of them. They spent the next month clearing brush and mending the old fence line. Elias built a pen near the slope where the goats would go, and Henry helped carry water to the new rows they'd planted in the softer field. Willa worked beside them, her hands blistered and brown, her eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. She wore her apron even in the sun, and her hair braided back with a strip of blue ribbon Elias had left on her chair one morning. One evening, as the shadows lengthened and the porch creaked with the weight of a day's end, Whit stepped behind her, his arms circling her waist. She leaned into him without thinking, her body fitting against his like it belonged nowhere else. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low against her ear. "You do that a lot. I want to give you something." She turned slightly. "You've already given me more than I ever thought I'd have." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch. Inside was a ring, simple band, no stone. Just gold, hammered smooth and warm from his hand. "I know we married quiet," he said. "No preacher, no celebration. But I want you to have this. Not because it's owed, but because it's right." She took it, eyes shining. "Will it fit? Tried it on your thimble when you weren't looking." She laughed then, soft and real, and slipped it onto her finger. Fit perfectly. They stood that way until the stars began to show. That fall, Clara took her first steps between the porch rail and Whit's outstretched hands. Her little fingers curled in triumph. Henry started writing his own name in charcoal on scrap wood, and Elias sold his first carving, a hawk in flight, to a passing trader who slipped him a coin and said, "That's good work, boy." They harvested more than they expected, and Willa traded the extra beans and cornmeal with the boarding house for muslin and boots. She hung dried sage and rosemary near the windows, and the house smelled of earth and warmth. The night before winter set in, they sat around the table, a stew boiling slow over the fire, and Willa looked at each of them, the boy who now laughed in fits, the one who carved in silence, the man who had placed his whole heart in her hands without ever asking for anything in return. She reached across and took Whit's hand. "We're not just surviving anymore," she said. Whit nodded. "No, we're living." She held his gaze, her voice quiet but sure. "And we're doing it together." He stood and drew her close, their foreheads touching as the firelight flickered behind them. The children lingered nearby, Elias carefully turning the stew, Henry humming a tune under his breath. Outside, the wind had picked up, but the house was warm, full, and still. Years later, the corn still rose tall each summer, and the goats multiplied enough to trade with the fort. Elias left once to see the Rio Grande, then came back with a journal and a plan to teach carving to the younger boys at the mission. Henry grew into his boots and took over the field rows, always humming that same tune. Clara climbed trees and read every book Miss Ada gave her, and one day built her own cradle for a doll Elias carved with care. Whit and Willa never left that patch of land. They built another room when the house got tight, and planted peach trees near the fence where the first cradle had once rocked. Each night, she lay beside him, her hands still wearing the gold band, her heart full. And in that quiet, honest life, they found a kind of love that didn't burn fast, but held steady like good timber, strong, warm, and meant to last.